For some time now, he had known that he was developing a powerful phobia about the high-rise. He was constantly aware of the immense weight of concrete stacked above him, and the sense that his body was the focus of the lines of force running through the building, almost as if Anthony Royal had deliberately designed his body to be held within their grip. At night, as he lay beside his sleeping wife, he would often wake from an uneasy dream into the suffocating bedroom, conscious of each of the 999 other apartments pressing on him through the walls and ceiling, forcing the air from his chest. He was sure that he had drowned the Afghan, not because he disliked the dog particularly, or wanted to upset its owner, but to revenge himself on the upper stories of the building. He had seized the dog in the darkness when it blundered into the pool. Giving into a cruel but powerful impulse, he had pulled it below the water. As he held its galvanized and thrashing body under the surface, in a strange way, he had been struggling with the building itself. Thinking of those distant heights, Wilder took his shower, turning the cold tap on full, and letting the icy jet roar across his chest and loins. Where Helen had begun to falter, he felt more determined, like a climber who has at long last reached the foot of the mountain he has prepared all his life to scale. Chapter 5. The Vertical City. Whatever plans he might devise for his ascent, whatever route to the summit, it was soon obvious to Wilder that at its present rate of erosion, little of the high-rise would be left. Almost everything possible was going wrong with the surfaces. He helped Helen straighten the apartment, and tried to jerk some sense of vitality into his dormant family by drawing blinds and moving noisily around the rooms. Wilder found it difficult to revive them. At 5-minute intervals, the air conditioning ceased to work, and in the warm summer weather the apartment was heavy with stagnant air. Wilder noticed that he had already begun to accept the fetid atmosphere as normal. Helen told him that she heard a rumor from the other residents that dog excrement had been deliberately dropped into the air-conditioning flues by the upper-level tenants. Strong winds circulated around the open plazas of the development project, buffeting the lower floors of the apartment building as they swirled through the concrete legs. Wilder opened the windows, hoping for some fresh air, but the apartment soon filled with dust and powdered cement. The ashy film already covered the tops of cupboards and bookshelves. By the late afternoon, the residents had begun to return from their offices. The elevators were noisy and overcrowded. 3 of them were now out of order, and the remainder were jammed with impatient tenants trying to reach their floors. From the open door of his apartment, Wilder watched his neighbors jostle each other aggressively like bad-tempered miners emerging from their pit cages. They strode past him, briefcases and handbags wielded like the instruments of an overnervous body armor. On an impulse, Wilder decided to test his rights of free passage around the building, and his access to all its services, particularly the swimming pool on the 35th floor and the children's sculpture garden on the observation roof. Taking his camera, he set out for the roof with the older of his 2 sons. However, he soon found that the high-speed elevators were either out of order, under repair, or kept permanently at the top floors with their doors jammed open. The only access to them was through the private outside entrance, to which Wilder did not have a key. All the more determined now to reach the roof, Wilder waited for one of the intermediate elevators which would carry them as far as the 35th floor. When it arrived, he pushed his way into the crowded cabin, surrounded by passengers who stared down at Wilder's 6-year-old son with unfeigned hostility. At the 23rd floor, the elevator refused to move any further. The passengers scrummaged their way out, drumming their briefcases against the closed doors of the elevators in what seemed to be a ritual display of temper. Wilder set off up the stairs, carrying his small son in his arms. With his powerful physique, he was strong enough to climb all the way to the roof. 2 floors above, however, the staircase was blocked by a group of local residents, among them the offensive young orthodontic surgeon who was Robert Lang's neighbor, trying to free a garbage disposal chute. Suspicious that they might be tampering with the air-conditioning ducts, Wilder pushed through them, but was briskly shouldered aside by a man he recognized as a newsreader for a rival television company. "This staircase is closed, Wilder. Can't you get the point?" "What?" Wilder was amazed by this effrontery. "How do you mean?" "Closed. What are you doing up here, anyway?" The two men squared up to each other. Amused by the announcer's aggressive manner, Wilder lifted the camera as if to film his florid face. When Crosland waved him away imperiously, Wilder was tempted to knock the man down. Not wishing to upset his son, who was nervous already in this harsh atmosphere, he retreated to the elevator and returned to the lower floors. The confrontation, however minor, had unsettled Wilder. Ignoring Helen, he prowled around the apartment, swinging the camera to and fro. He felt excited in a confused way, partly by his plans for the documentary, but also by the growing atmosphere of collision and hostility. From the balcony he watched the huge Alcatraz blocks of the nearby high-rises. The material about these buildings, visual and sociological, was almost limitless. They would film the exteriors from a helicopter, and from the nearest block 400 yards away. In his mind's eye he could already see a long, 60-second zoom, slowly moving from the whole building in frame to a close-up of a single apartment, one cell in this nightmare termitary. The first half of the program would examine life in the high-rise in terms of its design errors and minor irritations, while the remainder would then look at the psychology of living in a community of 2,000 people boxed up into the sky. Everything from the incidence of crime, divorce, and sexual misdemeanors to the turnover of residents, their health, the frequency of insomnia, and other psychosomatic disorders. All the evidence accumulated over several decades cast a critical light on the high-rise as a viable social structure, but cost-effectiveness in the area of public housing and high profitability in the private sector kept pushing these vertical townships into the sky against the real needs of their occupants. The psychology of high-rise life had been exposed with damning results. The absence of humor, for example, had always struck Wilder as the single most significant feature. All research by investigators confirmed that the tenants of high-rises made no jokes about them. In a strict sense, life there was eventless. On the basis of his own experience, Wilder was convinced that the high-rise apartment was an insufficiently flexible shell to provide the kind of home which encouraged activities, as distinct from somewhere to eat and sleep. Living in high-rises required a special type of behavior, one that was acquiescent, restrained, even perhaps slightly mad. A psychotic would have a ball here, Wilder reflected. Vandalism had plagued these slab and tower blocks since their inception. Every torn-out piece of telephone equipment, every handle wrenched off a fire safety door, every kicked-in electricity meter represented a stand against decerebration. What angered Wilder most of all about life in the apartment building was the way in which an apparently homogeneous collection of high-income professional people had split into three distinct and hostile camps. The old social subdivisions, based on power, capital, and self-interest, had reasserted themselves here as anywhere else. In effect, the high-rise had already divided itself into the three classical social groups, its lower, middle, and upper classes. The 10th-floor shopping mall formed a clear boundary between the lower 9 floors, with their proletariat of film technicians, air hostesses, and the like, and the middle section of the high-rise, which extended from the 10th floor to the swimming pool and restaurant deck on the 35th. This central 2/3 of the apartment building formed its middle class, made up of self-centered but basically docile members of the professions, the doctors and lawyers, accountants and tax specialists who worked not for themselves but for medical institutes and large corporations. Puritan and self-disciplined, they had all the cohesion of those eager to settle for second best. Above them, on the top 5 floors of the high-rise, was its upper class, the discreet oligarchy of minor tycoons and entrepreneurs, television actresses and careerist academics, with their high-speed elevators and superior services, their carpeted staircases. It was they who set the pace of the building. It was their complaints which were acted upon first. It was they who subtly dominated life within the high-rise, deciding when the children could use the swimming pools and roof garden, the menus in the restaurant, and the high charges that kept out almost everyone but themselves. Above all, it was their subtle patronage that kept the middle ranks in line, this constantly dangling carrot of friendship and approval. The thought of these exclusive residents, as high above him in their top-floor redoubts as any feudal lord above a serf, filled Wilder with a growing sense of impatience and resentment. However, it was difficult to organize any kind of counter-attack. It would be easy enough to play the populist leader and become a spokesman of his neighbors on the lower floors, but they lacked any cohesion or self-interest. They would be no match for the well-disciplined professional people in the central section of the apartment building. There was a latent easygoingness about them, an inclination to tolerate an undue amount of interference before simply packing up and moving on. In short, their territorial instinct, in its psychological and social senses, had atrophied to the point where they were ripe for exploitation. To rally his neighbors, Wilder needed something that would give them a strong feeling of identity. A television documentary would do this perfectly, and in terms, moreover, which they could understand. The documentary would dramatize all their resentments, and expose the way in which the services and facilities were being abused by the upper-level tenants. It might even be necessary to foment trouble surreptitiously, to exaggerate the tensions present in the high-rise. However, as Wilder soon discovered, the shape of his documentary was already being determined. Fired by his resolve to fight back, Wilder decided to give his wife and children a break from his ceaseless pacing. The air conditioning now worked for only 5 minutes in each hour, and by dusk the apartment was stuffy and humid. The noise of over-loud conversations and record players at full volume reverberated off the balconies above them. Helen Wilder moved along the already closed windows. Her small hands pressed numbly against the latches as if trying to push away the night. Too preoccupied to help her, Wilder set off with a towel and swimming trunks to the pool on the 10th floor. A few telephone calls to his neighbors on the lower floors had confirmed that they were keen to take part in the documentary, but Wilder needed participants from the upper and middle levels of the high-rise. The out-of-order elevators had still not been repaired, and Wilder took to the stairs. Sections of the staircase had already been turned into a garbage well by the residents above. Broken glass littered the steps, cutting his shoes. The shopping mall was crowded with people, milling about and talking at the tops of their voices as if waiting for a political rally to start. Usually deserted at this hour, the swimming pool was packed with residents playing the fool in the water, pushing each other off the tiled verge and splashing the changing stalls. The attendant had gone, abandoning his booth, and already the pool was beginning to look neglected, discarded towels lying in the gutters. In the showers, Wilder recognized Robert Lang. Although the doctor turned his back on him, Wilder ignored the rebuff and stood under the next spray. The two men spoke briefly, but in non-committal terms. Wilder had always found Lang good company, with his keen eye for any passing young woman, but today he was being standoffish. Like everyone else, he had been affected by the atmosphere of confrontation. "Have the police arrived yet?" Wilder asked above the noise as they walked to the diving boards. "No. Are you expecting them?" Lang seemed genuinely surprised. "They'll want to question witnesses. What happened, in fact? Was he pushed? His wife looks hefty enough. Perhaps she wanted a quick divorce." Lang smiled patiently, as if this remark in doubtful taste was all he expected of Wilder. His sharp eyes were deliberately vague, and remained closed to any probing. "I know nothing of the accident, Wilder. It may have been suicide, I suppose. Are you personally concerned?" "Aren't you, Lang? It's odd that a man can fall from a window 40 floors above the ground without there being any kind of investigation." Lang stepped onto the diving board. His body was unusually well-muscled, Wilder noticed, almost as if he had been taking a good deal of recent exercise, doing dozens of push-ups. Lang waited for a clear space in the crowded water. "I think we can rely on his neighbors to look after everything." Wilder lifted his voice. "I've begun planning the television documentary. His death would make a good starting point." Lang looked down at Wilder with sudden interest. He shook his head firmly. "I'd forget all about it, if I were you, Wilder." He stepped to the end of the board, sprang twice, and made a hard, neat dive into the yellowing water. Swimming by himself at the shallow end of the pool, Wilder watched Lang and his party of friends playing about in the deep end. Previously, Wilder would have joined them, particularly as there were 2 attractive women in the group, Charlotte Melville, whom he had not seen for several days about their projected parents' association, and the tyro-alcoholic Eleanor Powell. Wilder had obviously been excluded. Lang's pointed use of his surname marked the distance between them, like his vagueness about the dead jeweler. and his sidestepping of the television documentary in which he had once been keenly interested. If anything, Lang's approval had inspired Wilder to develop the idea into a provisional treatment. Treatment. Presumably Lang, with his excessive need for privacy, had no wish to see the collective folly of the residents, their childish squabbles and jealousies, exposed on the nation's television screens. Or was there some other impulse at work, a need to shut away, most of all from oneself, any realization of what was actually happening in the high-rise, so that events there could follow their own logic and get even more out of hand? For all his own professed enthusiasm about the documentary, Wilder knew that he had never discussed it with anyone who did not live inside the apartment building. Even Helen, talking to her mother that afternoon on the telephone, had said vaguely, "Everything's fine. There's some slight trouble with the air conditioning, but it's being fixed." This growing defiance of reality no longer surprised Wilder. The decision that the chaos within the high-rise was a matter for the residents themselves explained the mystery of the dead jeweler. At least 1,000 people must have seen the body. Wilder remembered stepping onto the balcony and being startled, not by the sight of the dead man, but by the huge audience reaching up into the sky. Had anyone notified the police? He had taken it for granted, but now was less sure. Wilder found it hard to believe that this sophisticated and self-important man would commit suicide. Yet no one was in the least concerned, accepting the possibility of murder in the same way that the swimmers in the pool accepted the wine bottles and beer cans rolling around the tiled floor under their feet. During the evening, Wilder's speculations took second place to the struggle to preserve his sanity. After settling the two boys in their bedroom, he and his wife sat down to dinner, only to find that a sudden electricity failure had plunged them into darkness. Sitting opposite each other at the dining-room table, they listened to the continuous noise from the corridor, their neighbors arguing in the elevator lobby, transistors blaring through open apartment doors. Helen began to laugh, relaxing for the first time in weeks. "Dick, it's a huge children's party that's got out of hand." She reached out to calm Wilder. In the faint light that crossed the room from the nearby high-rise, her slim face had an almost unreal calm, as if she no longer felt herself to be part of the events taking place around her. Restraining his temper, Wilder hunched heavily in the darkness over the table. He was tempted more than once to plunge his fist into the soup. When the lights returned, he tried to telephone the building manager, but the switchboard was jammed with calls. At last a recorded voice told him that the manager had fallen ill, and that all complaints would be played through and noted for future attention. "My God, he's actually going to listen to all these tapes. There must be miles of them." "Are you sure?" Helen was giggling to herself. "Perhaps no one else minds. You're the only one." The tampering with the electricity system had affected the air conditioning. Dust was spurting from the vents in the walls. Exasperated, Wilder drove his fists together. Like a huge and aggressive malefactor, the high-rise was determined to inflict every conceivable hostility upon them. Wilder tried to close the grills, but within minutes they were forced to take refuge on the balcony. Their neighbors were crowded against their railings, craning up at the roof, as if hoping to catch sight of those responsible. Leaving his wife, who was wandering light-heartedly around the apartment and smiling at the spurting dust, Wilder went out into the corridor. All the elevators were stationary in the upper section of the building. A large group of his neighbors had gathered in the elevator lobby, pounding rhythmically on the doors and complaining about various provocative acts by the residents on the floors above. Wilder pushed his way towards the center, where 2 airline pilots were standing on a lobby sofa and selecting the members of a raiding party. Wilder waited his turn, trying to catch their attention, until he realized from the excited talk around him that their mission consisted solely of going up to the 35th floor and publicly urinating into the water. Wilder was about to argue with them, warning that a childish act of this kind would be counterproductive. Until they were organized, the notion of a punitive expedition was absurd, as they were far too exposed to retaliation. However, at the last moment, he turned away. He stood by the doors to the staircase, aware that he no longer felt committed to this crowd of impulsive tenants egging each other on to a futile exercise. Their real opponent was not the hierarchy of residents in the heights far above them, but the image of the building in their own minds, the multiplying layers of concrete that anchored them to the floor. A cheer went up, followed by a chorus of catcalls. An elevator was descending from the 35th floor, the indicator numerals flashing from right to left. While it approached, Wilder thought of Helen and the two boys. He knew already that his decision to dissociate himself from his neighbors had nothing to do with any feelings of concern for his wife and children. The elevator reached the 2nd floor and stopped. As the doors opened, there was a sudden hush. Lying on the floor of the cabin was the barely conscious figure of one of Wilder's neighbors, a homosexual air traffic controller who dined regularly in the 35th floor restaurant. He turned his bruised face away from the watching crowd and tried to button the shirt torn from his chest. Seeing him clearly as the crowd stepped back, awed by this evidence of open violence, Wilder heard someone say that 2 more floors, the 5th and 8th, were now in darkness. Chapter 6. Danger in the Streets of the Sky. All day Richard Wilder had been preparing for his ascent. After the noise-filled night, which he had spent calming his sons and his giggling wife, Wilder left for the television studios. Once there, he cancelled his appointments and told his secretary that he would be away for the next few days. While he spoke, Wilder was barely aware of this puzzled young woman or his curious colleagues in the nearby offices. He had shaved only the left side of his face, and had not changed his clothes since the previous day. Tired out, he briefly fell asleep at his desk, watched by a secretary as he slumped snoring across his unread correspondence. After no more than an hour at the studios, he packed his briefcase and returned to the high-rise. For Wilder, this brief period away from the apartment building was almost dreamlike in its unreality. He left his car in the parking lot without locking it, and walked towards the entrance, a growing sense of relief coming over him. Even the debris scattered at the foot of the building, the empty bottles and garbage-stained cars with their broken windscreens, in a strange way merely reinforced his conviction that the only real events in his life were those taking place within the high-rise. Although it was after 11 o'clock, Helen and the children were still asleep. A film of white dust covered the furniture in the lounge and bedrooms, as if he had returned to the apartment, and its 3 sleepers, after an immense period of time, had condensed around them like a stone frost. Wilder had blocked the air-conditioning vents during the night, and the apartment was without sound or movement. Wilder looked down at his wife, lying on the bed surrounded by the children's books she was reviewing. Aware that he would be leaving her in a few hours, he regretted that she was too weak to come with him. They might have climbed the high-rise together. Trying to think more clearly about his ascent, Wilder began to clean the apartment. He stepped out onto the balcony and swept up the cigarette butts and broken glass, condoms and torn newspapers thrown down from the floors above. He could no longer remember when he had made his decision to climb the building, and had little idea of what exactly he would do when he finally got there. He was also well aware of the disparity between the simple business of climbing to the roof, a matter of pressing an elevator button, and the mythologized version of this ascent that had taken over his mind. This same surrender to a logic more powerful than reason was evident in the behavior of Wilder's neighbors. In the elevator lobby, he listened to the latest rumors. Earlier that morning there had been a serious brawl between the 9th and the 11th floor tenants. The 10th floor concourse was now a no-man's land between 2 warring factions, the residents of the lower 9 floors and those in the middle section of the building. Despite the harassment and increasing violence, no one was surprised by these events. The routines of daily life within the high-rise, the visits to the supermarket, liquor store, and hairdressing salon, continued as before. In some way, the high-rise was able to accommodate this double logic. Even the tone of voice of his neighbors, as they described these outbreaks of hostility, was calm and matter-of-fact, like that of civilians in a war-torn city dealing with yet another air raid. For the first time it occurred to Wilder that the residents enjoyed this breakdown of its services and the growing confrontation between themselves. All this brought them together and ended the frigid isolation of the previous months. During the afternoon, Wilder played with his sons and waited for the evening to come. Helen moved silently around the apartment, barely aware of her husband. After the fit of compulsive laughter the previous evening, her face was waxy and expressionless. Now and then a tick flickered in the right apex of her mouth, as if reflecting a tremor deep within her mind. She sat at the dining table, mechanically straightening the boy's hair. Watching her, and unable to think of what he could do to help her, Wilder almost believed that it was she who was leaving him, rather than the contrary. As the light began to fade, Wilder watched the first of the residents return from their offices. Among them, stepping from a car, was Jane Sheridan. 6 months earlier, Wilder had broken off a brief affair with the actress, ironically enough, because of the effort involved in reaching the 37th floor. He had found it difficult to be himself in her apartment. All the time he was conscious of the distance to the ground, and of his wife and children far below him, deep in the lowest seams of the building like the exploited women and child laborers of the 19th century. Watching television during their sexual acts in her chintz-lined bedroom, he felt as if he were high over the city in a lavish executive airliner fitted with boudoir and cocktail bar. Their conversations, even their diction and vocabulary, had become as stylized as those of strangers in adjacent aircraft seats. The actress walked to the private entrance of the upper-floor elevator lobby, picking her way casually through the broken bottles and empty cans. A single journey to her apartment would carry him, like a ladder in a board game, virtually to the top of the high-rise with one throw of the dice. Helen was putting the boys to bed. She had moved the wardrobe and dressing table around their beds, in an attempt to shield them from the noise and disturbances which the night would bring. "Richard, are you going?" As she spoke, she emerged briefly from the deep well inside herself, aware for these few seconds that she and her sons were about to be left on their own. Wilder waited for this moment of lucidity to pass, knowing that it would be impossible to describe his self-imposed mission to Helen. She sat silently on her bed, a hand resting on the pile of children's books, watching him in the mirror with an unchanging expression as he stepped into the corridor. Wilder soon found that it was more difficult than he assumed to climb to the 37th floor. The 5 top-floor elevators were either out of order or had been taken to the upper levels and parked there with their doors jammed open. The second-floor lobby was crowded with Wilder's neighbors, some in office suits, others in beachwear, arguing with each other like disgruntled tourists caught by a currency crisis. Wilder pushed through them to the staircase and began the long climb to the 10th floor, where he stood a better chance of finding an ascending elevator. When he reached the 5th floor, he met the dozen members of the airline pilots' raiding party returning from another of their abortive missions. Angry and shaken, they shouted at the people jeering down at them from the stairwell above. The entrance to the 10th floor concourse had been blocked by desks and chairs taken from the junior school and flung down the stairs. The raiding party, made up of parents of the children attending the school, had tried to replace the desks, harassed by residents from the middle floors waiting impatiently for the liquor store to be restocked. Wilder pressed on past them. By the time he reached the 10th floor, the opposing group had moved off in a posse. Wilder stepped over the broken desks lying on the steps, pencils and crayons scattered around them. Wishing that he had brought his camera with him, he noticed 2 18th-floor residents, a chemical engineer and a personal manager, standing by the door. Each had a cinecamera and was carefully filming the scene below, following Wilder as he climbed towards them. Leaving them to complete these dubious private newsreels, Wilder pushed back the swing doors and looked out at the deck of the shopping mall. Hundreds of residents jostled against each other, pulling and shoving among the wine bins and shelves of detergent packs, wine trolleys locked together in a mesh of chromium wire. Voices rose in anger above the singing of cash registers. Meanwhile, as these scuffles took place, a line of women customers sat under the dryers in the hairdressing salon, calmly reading their magazines. The 2 cash registers on evening duty at the bank impassively counted out their banknotes. Giving up any attempt to cross the concourse, Wilder turned into the deserted swimming pool. The water level was down by at least 6 inches, as if someone had been stealing the yellowing of fluid. Wilder walked around the pool. An empty wine bottle floated in the center, surrounded by a swill of cigarette packs and unraveling cigar butts. Below the diving boards, a newspaper hung slackly in the water, its wavering headline like a message from another world. In the 10th floor lobby, a crowd of residents pressed impatiently against the elevator doors, their arms laden with liquor cartons and delicatessen purchases, raw materials for the aggressive parties of that evening. Walter returned to the staircase. Somewhere above him, these passengers would step out of their elevators and give him a chance to get aboard. He climbed the steps 2 at a time. The staircase was deserted. The higher up the building, more reluctant were the residents to use the stairs. The stairs. The stairs. The stairs. As if this in some way demeaned them. As he pressed on upwards, Wilder peered through the windows at the car park sinking from view below. The distant arm of the river stretched towards the darkening outline of the city, a signpost pointing towards a forgotten world. As he turned into the final stretch of steps to the 14th floor, picking his way among the discarded cans and cigarette packs, something moved above his head. Wilder paused and looked up, his lungs pumping in the silence. A kitchen chair whirled through the air towards his head, hurled down by an assailant 3 floors above. Wilder flinched back as the steel chair struck the railing, glancing against his right arm before spinning away. Wilder crouched against the steps, shielding himself below the overhang of the next floor. He massaged his bruised arm. At least 3 or 4 people were waiting for him, ostentatiously tapping their clubs on the metal railing. Fists clenching, Wilder searched the steps for a weapon. Danger in the streets of the sky, his first impulse was to rush the stairs and counterattack. With his powerful physique, he knew that he could put to flight any 3 residents of the high-rise. These under-exercised and overweight account executives and corporation lawyers egged on into this well-bred violence by their pushy wives. However, he calmed himself, deciding against a frontal attack. He would reach the top of the high-rise, but by guile, rather than by brute force. He moved down to the 13th floor landing. Through the walls of the elevator shaft he could hear the rails and cables humming. Passengers were stepping out of the elevators onto their floors. But the doors onto the 13th floor lobby had been bolted. A face frowned out at him. A well-groomed hand curtly waved him away. All the way down to the 10th floor the communicating doors had been locked or barricaded. Frustrated, Wilder returned to the shopping mall. A large crowd was still waiting by the elevators. They formed clearly demarked groups from different floors, each commandeering its own transit system. Wilder left them and strode towards the supermarket. The shelves had been stripped, and the staff had left after locking the turnstiles. Wilder vaulted over a checkout counter and made his way to the storeroom at the rear. Beyond the pyramids of empty cartons was one of the 3 service cores of the high-rise, containing a freight elevator, and the water, air conditioning, and electrical supply trunks. Wilder waited as the elevator descended cumbrously down its shaft, the size of a carrier's aircraft lift. It had been designed to carry kitchen appliance islands, bathroom units, and the huge pop art and abstract expressionist paintings favored by the residents of the high-rise. As he pulled back the steel grille, he noticed a thin-shouldered young woman hiding behind the control panel. She was pallid and undernourished, but she watched Wilder with interest, as if glad to welcome him to this private domain. "How far do you want to go?" she asked him. "We can travel anywhere. I'll ride with you." Wilder recognized her as a masseuse from the 5th floor, one of the vagrants who spent their time wandering about the high-rise, the denizens of an interior world who formed a second invisible population. "All right. What about the 35th floor?" "The people on the 30th are nicer." Expertly she pressed the control buttons, activating the heavy doors. Within seconds, the elevator was carrying them ponderously aloft. The young masseuse smiled at him encouragingly, alive now that they were moving. "If you want to go higher, I'll show you. There are lots of air shafts, you know. The trouble is, dogs have gotten to them. They're getting hungry." An hour later, when Wilder stepped out into the lavishly carpeted lobby of the 37th floor, he realized that he had discovered a second building inside the one that he had originally occupied. He left behind the young masseuse, endlessly climbing the service shafts and freight wells of the high-rise, transits that externalized an odyssey taking place inside her head. During his roundabout route with her, changing to a second freight elevator to climb 3 floors to the 28th, moving up and down a maze of corridors on the borders of hostile enclaves, until finally taking an upper-level elevator a journey of one story. Wilder had seen the way in which the middle and upper levels of the building had organized themselves. While his neighbors on the lower floors remained a confused rabble united only by their sense of impotence, here everyone had joined a local group of 30 adjacent apartments, informal clans spanning 2 or 3 floors based on the architecture of corridors, lobbies, and elevators. There were now some 20 of these groups, each of which had formed local alliances with those on either side. There was a marked increase in vigilante activity of all kinds. Barriers were being set up, fire doors locked, garbage thrown down the stairwells or dumped on rival landings. On the 29th floor, Wilder came across a commune composed exclusively of women, a cluster of apartments dominated by an elderly children's stories writer, a woman of intimidating physique and personality. Sharing an apartment with her were 3 air hostesses from the first floor. Wilder walked gingerly down the corridor between their apartments, glad of the company of the young masseuse. What unsettled Wilder, as the women questioned him in pairs from their half-open doors, was their hostility to him, not only because he was a man, but because he was so obviously trying to climb to a level above his own. He stepped out with relief into the deserted lobby of the 37th floor. He stood by the staircase doors, suspicious that no one was guarding the lobby. Conceivably, the residents here were unaware of what was going on beneath their feet. The carpets in the silent corridors were thick enough to insulate them from hell itself. He walked down the corridor towards Jane Sheridan's apartment. She might be surprised to see him, but Wilder was confident that he would spend the night with her. The next day he would move in permanently, and visit Helen and the boys on his way to and from the television studios. As he pressed the bell, he could hear her strong, masculine voice through the door, its tone familiar from countless television costume dramas. At last the door opened, held on its latch chain. When she looked out at Wilder, recognizing him immediately, he knew that she had been waiting for him to arrive. She was detached and uneasy at the same time, like a spectator forced to watch someone about to be involved in an accident. Wilder remembered that he had given his destination to one of the women's vigilante groups. "Jane, you're expecting me. I'm flattered." "Wilder, I can't." Before Wilder could speak, the door of the next apartment opened sharply. Staring at Wilder with undisguised hostility were a text specialist from the 40th floor and an over-muscled choreographer with whom Wilder had often heaved a medicine ball in the 10th floor gymnasium. Realizing that his arrival had been anticipated by all these groups, Wilder turned to leave, but the corridor behind him was blocked. A group of 6 residents had emerged together from the elevator lobby. They wore tracksuits and white sneakers, and at first sight looked like a middle-aged gymnasium dumbbell team, each carrying his polished wooden clubs. Leading this antique but sprightly troop, which consisted of a stockbroker, 2 pediatricians, and 3 senior academics, was Anthony Royal. As usual, he wore his white safari jacket, a costume which always irritated Wilder, the kind of garment that might be affected by an eccentric camp commander or a zookeeper. The corridor lighting flushed his blond hair and picked out the scars on his forehead, a confusing notation that hung like a series of mocking question marks over his stern expression. As he approached Wilder, the chromium walking stick flicked in his hand like a cane. Wilder watched the polished shaft catch the light, looking forward with pleasure to wrapping it around Royal's neck. Although well aware that he had been trapped, Wilder found himself laughing aloud at the sight of this lunatic troop. When the lights failed, first dipping warningly, then going out altogether, he backed against the wall to allow the group to pass. The wooden clubs clicked around him in the darkness, beating out a well-rehearsed tattoo. From the open door of Jane Sheridan's apartment, a torch flared at him. Around Wilder, the dumbbell troop was beginning its act. The first clubs whirled in the torchlight. Without any warning, he felt a flurry of blows on his shoulders. Before he fell, Wilder seized one of the clubs, but the others struck him to the carpeted floor at Anthony Royal's feet. When he woke, he was lying outstretched on a sofa in the ground-floor entrance lobby. Fluorescent lights shone around him, reflected in the glass ceiling panels. With their toneless glow, they seemed to have been shining forever somewhere inside his head. 2 residents returning late to the high-rise waited by the elevators. Holding tightly to their briefcases, they ignored Wilder, whom they clearly assumed to be drunk. Aware of his bruised shoulders, Wilder reached up and nursed the swollen mastoid bone behind his right ear. When he could stand, he wandered away from the sofa towards the entrance and steadied himself against the glass doors. The lines of parked cars stretched through the darkness, enough transport to evacuate him to 1,001 destinations. He walked out into the cold night air. Holding his neck, he looked up at the face of the high-rise. He could almost pick out the lights of the 37th floor. He suddenly felt exhausted, as much by the building's weight and mass as by his own failure. His casual and unthought-out attempt to scale the building had ended humiliatingly. In a sense, he had been rejected more by the high-rise than by Royal and his friends. Lowering his eyes from the roof, he saw that his wife, 50 above him, was watching from the balcony of their apartment. Despite his disheveled clothes and bruised face, she showed no concern, as if she no longer recognized him. Chapter 7. Preparations for Departure. High above, on the 40th floor, the first two residents were preparing to leave. All day, Anthony Royal and his wife had been packing. After lunch in the deserted restaurant on the 35th floor, they returned to their apartment, where Royal spent what he knew would be his last hours in the high-rise, closing down his design studio. In no hurry to leave, now that the moment had come for them to abandon the building, Royal deliberately took his time over this last ritual task. The air conditioning had ceased to function, and the absence of its vague, familiar hum, once a source of minor irritation, made Royal restless. However reluctantly, he was now forced to recognize what he had been trying to repress for the past month, despite the evidence of his eyes. This huge building he had helped to design was moribund. Its vital functions fading one by one, the water pressure falling as the pumps faltered, the electrical substations on each floor switching themselves off, the elevators stranded in their shafts. As if in sympathy, the old injuries to his legs and back had begun to keen again. Royal leaned against his drawing stand, feeling the pain radiate upwards from his knees into his groin. Gripping the chromium cane, he left the studio and moved among the tables and armchairs in the drawing-room, each shrouded in its dust sheet. In the years since his accident, he had found that constant exercise alone held back the pain, and he missed the games of squash with Robert Lang. Like his own physicians, Lang had told him that the injuries sustained in car crashes took a great deal of time to heal, but Royal recently had begun to suspect that these wounds were playing a devious role of their own. The 3 suitcases he had packed that morning stood ready in the hall. Royal stared down at them, for a moment hoping that they belonged to someone else. The cases had never been used, and the prominent part they would soon play in his personal Dunkirk only rubbed in the humiliation. Royal returned to the studio and continued to take down the architectural drawings and design studies pinned to the walls. This small office and a converted bedroom he had used for his work on the development project, and the collection of books and blueprints, photographs and drawing boards, originally intended to give a sense of purpose to his convalescence, had soon become a kind of private museum. The majority of the plans and design studies had been superseded by his colleagues after the accident, but in a strange way, these old frontal elevations of the concert hall and television studios, like the photograph of himself standing on the roof of the high-rise on handover day, described a more real world than the building which he was now about to abandon. The decision to leave their apartment, already postponed for too long, had been difficult to take. For all his professional identification with the high-rise as one of its architects, Royal's contribution had been minor, but, sadly for him, had concerned those very sections which had borne the brunt of the residents' hostility. The 10th-floor concourse, the junior school, the observation roof with its children's sculpture garden, and the furnishing and design of the elevator lobbies. Royal had gone to immense care in the choice of wall surfaces, now covered by thousands of aerosoled obscenities. It was stupid of him, perhaps, but it was difficult not to take them personally, particularly as he was only too aware of his neighbor's hostility towards him. The chromium cane and the white Alsatian were no longer theatrical props. In principle, the mutiny of these well-to-do professional people against the building they had collectively purchased was no different from the dozens of well-documented revolts by working-class tenants against municipal tower blocks that had taken place at frequent intervals during the post-war years. But once again, Royal had found himself reacting personally to these acts of vandalism. The breakdown of the building as a social structure was a rebellion against himself. So much so that in the early days after the jeweler's unexplained death, he expected to be physically attacked. Later, however, the collapse of the high-rise began to strengthen his will to win through. The testing of the building he had helped to design was a testing of himself. Above all, he became aware that a new social order was beginning to emerge around him. Royal was certain that a rigid hierarchy of some kind was the key to the elusive success of these huge buildings. As he often pointed out to Anne, office blocks containing as many as 30,000 workers functioned smoothly for decades thanks to a social hierarchy as rigid and as formalized as an anthill's, with an incidence of crime, social unrest, and petty misdemeanors that was virtually nil. The confused but unmistakable emergence of this new social order, apparently based on small tribal enclaves, fascinated Royal. To begin with, he had been determined to stay on, come what may, and whatever the hostility directed against him, in the hope of acting as its midwife. In fact, this alone had stopped him from notifying his former colleagues of the mounting chaos within the building. As he told himself repeatedly, the present breakdown of the high-rise might well mark its success rather than its failure. Without realizing it, he had given these people a means of escaping into a new life, and a pattern of social organization that would become the paradigm of all future high-rise blocks. But these dreams of helping the 2,000 residents towards their new Jerusalem meant nothing to Anne. As the air conditioning and electricity supply began to fail, and it became dangerous to move unaccompanied around the building, she told Royal that they were leaving. Playing on Royal's concern for her and his own feelings of guilt about the breakdown of the high-rise, she soon persuaded him that they must go. Curious to see how she was getting on with her packing, Royal walked into his wife's bedroom. 2 wardrobe trunks and a selection of small and large suitcases. Jewelry boxes and vanity cases lay open on the floor and dressing table like a luggage store display. Anne was packing, or unpacking, one of the cases in front of the dressing table mirror. Recently, Royal had noticed that she deliberately surrounded herself with mirrors, as if this replication of herself gave her some kind of security. Anne had always taken for granted a naturally deferential world, and the last few weeks, even in the comparative safety of this penthouse apartment, she had found more and more trying. The childlike strains in her character had begun to come out again, as if she was suiting her behavior for the overextended Mad Hatter's tea party that she had been forced to attend like a reluctant Alice. The journey down to the 35th floor restaurant had become a daily ordeal, and only the prospect of leaving the apartment building for good had kept her going. She stood up and embraced Royal. As usual, without thinking, she touched the scars on his forehead with her lips, as if trying to read a digest of the 25 years that separated them, a key to that part of Royal's life she had never known. As she recovered from the accident, sitting in the windows of the penthouse or exercising on the calisthenics machine, he had noticed how much his wounds had intrigued her. "What a mess!" She gazed down hopefully at the jumble of suitcases. "I'll be about an hour. Have you called the taxi?" "We'll need at least 2. They refuse to wait now. There's no point in calling them until we're on the doorstep." Both their own cars, parked in the line nearest to the building, had been damaged by the tenants below, their windscreens knocked out by falling bottles. Anne returned to her packing. "The important thing is that we're going. We should have left a month ago when I wanted to. Why anyone stays on here, I can't imagine." "Anne, we're leaving." "At last. And why has no one called the police or complained to the owners?" "We are the owners." Royal turned his head away from her, his smile of affection stiffening. Through the windows he watched the light fading across the curtain walling of the nearby high-rises. Inevitably he had always taken Anne's criticisms as a comment on himself. As Royal knew now, his young wife would never be happy in the special atmosphere of the high-rise. The only daughter of a provincial industrialist, she had been brought up in the insulated world of a large country house, a finicky copy of a Loire chateau maintained by a staff of servants in the full-blown 19th-century manner. In the apartment building, by contrast, the servants who waited on her were an invisible army of thermostats and humidity sensors, computerized elevator route switches and overriders, playing their parts in a far more sophisticated and abstract version of the master-servant relationship. However, in Anne's world, it was not only necessary for work to be done, but be seen to be done. The steady breakdown of the building's services and the confrontation between the rival groups of the tenants had been too much for her, playing on her huge sense of insecurity. All her long-ingrained upper-class uncertainties about maintaining her superior place in the world. The present troubles in the apartment block had exposed these mercilessly. When he had first met her, Royal had taken for granted her absolute self-confidence, but in fact the reverse was true. Far from being sure of herself, Anne needed constantly to re-establish her position on the top rung of the ladder. By comparison, the professional people around her, who had achieved everything as a result of their own talents, were models of self-assurance. When they first moved into the high-rise as its first tenants, they had both intended the apartment to be no more than a pied-à-terre, conveniently close to Royal's work on the development project. As soon as they found a house in London, they would leave. But Royal noticed that he continued to postpone any decision to move out. He was intrigued by life in this vertical township, and by the kind of people attracted to its smooth functionalism. As the first tenant, and owner of the best and highest apartment, he felt himself to be lord of the manor, borrowing a phrase he disliked from Anne's rule-book. His sense of physical superiority as a sometime amateur tennis champion, a minor hardcourts title, though no less impressive for that, had inevitably slackened with the passage of years, but in a way had been rekindled by the presence of so many people directly below him, on the shoulders of whose far more modest dwellings his own rested securely. Even after his accident, when he had been forced to sell out his partnership and retreat to a wheelchair in the penthouse, he had felt this sense of renewed physical authority. During the months of convalescence, as his wounds healed and his body grew stronger, each of the new tenants in some way seemed identified with his strengthening muscles and sinews, his quickening reflexes, each one bringing his invisible tribute to Royal's well-being. For Anne, by contrast, the continued flow of new arrivals puzzled and irritated her. She had enjoyed the apartment when they were alone in the high-rise, taking it for granted that no one else would appear. She rode the elevators as if they were the grandly upholstered gondolas of a private funicular, swam alone in the undisturbed waters of the 2 swimming pools, and strolled about the shopping concourse as if visiting her own personal bank, hairdresser, and supermarket. By the time that the last of the 2,000 residents had appeared and taken their place below, Anne was impatient to move. But Royal was drawn to his new neighbors, exemplars beyond anything he had previously imagined of the Puritan work ethic. In turn, he knew from Anne that his neighbors found him a puzzling and aloof figure, an automobile crash casualty in his wheelchair, living on the roof of the high-rise in a casual ménage with a rich young wife half his age, whom he was happy to see taken out by other men. Despite this symbolic emasculation, Royal was still regarded in some way as having the key to the building. His scarred forehead and chromium cane, the white jacket which he affected and wore like a target, together seemed to be the elements of a code that concealed the real relationship between the architect of this huge building and its uneasy tenants. Even Anne's always imminent promiscuities were part of this same system of ironies, appealing to Royal's liking for the game situation, where one could risk everything and lose nothing. The effect of all this on his neighbors interested Royal, and particularly on those mavericks such as Richard Wilder, who would set out to climb Everest equipped with nothing more than a sense of irritation that the mountain was larger than himself, or Dr. Lang, staring out all day from his balcony under the fond impression that he was totally detached from the high-rise, when, in fact, he was probably its most true tenant. At least Lang knew his place, and kept to it. 3 nights earlier they had been forced to give Wilder a short, sharp lesson. Thinking about Wilder's intrusion, only one in a series of attempts by people below to break into the top-floor apartments, Royal left the bedroom and checked the bolts on the front door. Anne waited while he stood in the deserted corridor. There was a continuous sullen murmur from the lower levels carried up the elevator shafts. She pointed to Royal's 3 suitcases. "Is that all you're taking?" "For the time being. I'll come back for anything else." "Come back? Why should you want to? Perhaps you'd rather stay." To himself, rather than to his wife, Royal remarked, "First to arrive, last to leave." "Is that a joke?" "Of course not." Anne placed a hand on his chest, as if searching for an old wound. "It's really all over, you know. I hate to say it. This place hasn't worked." "Perhaps not." Royal took her commiseration with a strong dose of salt. Without realizing it, Anne often played on his sense of failure, frightened by Royal's new resolve to prove himself, this conviction that the building might succeed after all. In addition, their neighbors had accepted him a little too readily as their leader. His partnership in the consortium had been largely paid for by the commissions her father had steered his way, a fact Anne had never let him forget, not to humble Royal so much as to prove her own value to him. The point was made, though. He had come up in the world, all right, in too many senses of the term. In an insane way, his accident might have been an attempt to break out of the trap. But all this belonged to the past now. As Royal knew, they were leaving just in time. During the last few days, life in the high-rise had become impossible. For the first time, the top-floor residents were directly involved. The erosion of everything continued, a slow psychological avalanche that was carrying them downwards. Superficially, life in the apartment building was normal enough. Most of the residents left for their offices each day, the supermarket was still open, the bank and hairdressing salon functioned as usual. Nonetheless, the real internal atmosphere was that of 3 uneasily coexisting armed camps. A complete hardening of positions had taken place, and there was now almost no contact between the upper, middle, and lower groups. During the early part of the day, it was possible to move freely around the building, but as the afternoon proceeded, this became increasingly difficult. By dusk, any movement was impossible. The bank and supermarket closed at 3 o'clock. The junior school had moved from its vandalized classrooms to 2 apartments on the 7th floor. Few children were ever seen above the 10th floor, let alone in the sculpture garden on the roof which Royal had designed for them with so much care. The 10th floor swimming pool was a half-empty pit of yellowing water and floating debris. One of the squash courts had been locked, and the other 3 were filled with garbage and broken classroom furniture. Of the 20 elevators in the building, 3 were permanently out of order, and by evening the remainder had become the private transit lines of the rival groups who could seize them. 5 floors were without electricity. At night the dark bands stretched around the face of the high-rise like dead strata in a fading brain. Fortunately for Royal and his neighbors, conditions in the upper section of the building had yet to decline so steeply. The restaurant had discontinued its evening service, but a limited luncheon was available each day during the few hours when the small staff could freely enter and leave. However, the 2 waiters had already gone, and Royal guessed that the chef and his wife would soon follow. The swimming pool on the 35th floor was usable, but the level had fallen, and the water supply, like that to their own apartment, was dependent on the vagaries of the roof tanks and electrical pumps. From the drawing-room windows, Royal looked down into the parking lot. Many of the cars had not been moved for weeks, windscreens broken by falling bottles, cabins filled with garbage. They sat on flattening tires, surrounded by a sea of rubbish that spread outwards around the building like an enlarging stain. This visible index of the block's decline at the same time measured the extent to which its tenants accepted this process of erosion. At times Royal suspected that his neighbors unconsciously hoped that everything would decline even further. Royal had noticed that the manager's office was no longer besieged by indignant residents. Even his own top-floor neighbors, who in the early days had been only too quick to complain about everything, now never criticized the building. In the absence of the manager, still lying in a state of mental collapse in his ground-floor apartment, His dwindling staff of 2, the wives of a dubbing mixer on the 2nd floor and a first violinist on the 3rd, sat stoically at their desks in the entrance lobby, oblivious of the deterioration going on apace over their heads. What interested Royal was the way in which the residents had become exaggeratedly crude in their response to the apartment building, deliberately abusing the elevators and air conditioning systems, overstraining the power supply. This carelessness about their own convenience reflected a shuffling of mental priorities, and perhaps the emergence of a new social and psychological order for which Royal was waiting. He remembered the attack on Wilder, who had laughed happily as the group of pediatricians and academics had flailed away at him with their dumbbells like a troupe of demented gymnasts. 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 Royal had found the episode grotesque, but he guessed that in some obscure way Wilder had been glad to be flung half-conscious into an elevator. Royal strolled around the shrouded furniture. He raised his stick and slashed at the stale air with the same stroke he had used against Wilder. At any moment a battalion of police would arrive and cart them all off to the nearest jail. Or would they? What played straight into the residents' hands was the remarkably self-contained nature of the high-rise, a self-administered enclave within the larger private domain of the development project. The manager and his staff, the personnel who manned the supermarket, bank, and hairdressing salon, were all residents of the apartment building. The few outsiders had left or been sacked. The engineers who serviced the building did so on instructions from the manager, and clearly none had been issued. They might even have been told to stay away. No garbage collection vehicle had called for several days, and a large number of the chutes were blocked. Despite the growing chaos around them, the residents showed less interest in the external world. Bales of unsorted mail lay about in the ground-floor lobbies. As for the debris scattered around the high-rise, the broken bottles and cans, these were barely noticeable from the ground. Even the damaged cars were to some extent concealed by the piles of building materials, wooden forms and sand pits that had yet to be cleared away. Besides, as part of that unconscious conspiracy to shut out the external world, no visitors came to the high-rise. He and Anne had invited none of their friends to the apartment for months. Royal watched his wife move about vaguely in her bedroom. Jane Sheridan, Anne's closest friend, had called and was helping her to pack. The two women were transferring a line of evening gowns from the wardrobe racks to the trunks, and at the same time returning unwanted shirts and trousers from the suitcases back to the shelves. For all the activity, it was uncertain whether they were packing on the eve of departure or unpacking on arrival. "Anne, are you coming or going?" Royal asked. "We hardly stand a chance of making it tonight." Anne gestured helplessly at the half-filled cases. "It's the air conditioning. I can't think." "You won't get out now, even if you want to," Jane told her. "We're marooned here, as far as I can see. All the elevators have been commandeered by the other floors." "What? Did you hear that?" Anne stared angrily at Royal, as if his faulty design of the elevator lobbies was directly responsible for these acts of piracy. "All right, we'll leave first thing tomorrow. What about food? The restaurant will be shut." They had never eaten in the apartment, Anne's gesture of contempt for her neighbor's endless preparations of elaborate meals. The only food in the refrigerator was the dog's. Royal stared at himself in the mirror, adjusting his white jacket. In the fading light, his reflection had almost a spectral vibrancy, making him look like an illuminated corpse. "Well, think of something." A curious answer, he realized, implying that there were other sources of food than the supermarket. He looked down at Jane Sheridan's plump figure. Seeing Royal's subdued expression, she was smiling reassuringly at him. Royal had taken on the task of looking after this amiable young woman since the death of her Afghan. "The elevators may be free in an hour or so," he told them. "We'll go down to the supermarket." Thinking of the Alsatian, presumably asleep on his bed in the penthouse, he decided to exercise it on the roof. Anne had begun to empty the half-filled suitcases. She seemed barely aware of what she was doing, as if a large part of her mind had been switched off. For all her complaints, she had never telephoned the building manager herself. Perhaps she felt this was beneath her. But nor had she mentioned the smallest criticism to any of their friends in the world beyond the apartment building. Thinking about this, Royal noticed that the plug of her bedside telephone had been pulled from its socket, and the cable neatly wrapped around the receiver. As he walked around the apartment before going to search for the dog, he saw that the 3 other external telephones, in the hall, drawing room, and kitchen, had also been disconnected. Royal realized why they had received no outside calls during the previous week, and felt a distinct sense of security at knowing that they would receive none in the future. Already he guessed that, for all their expressed intentions, they would not be leaving either the following morning or any other. Chapter 8. The Predatory Birds. From the open windows of the penthouse, Royal watched the huge birds clustering on the elevator heads 50 feet away. An unfamiliar species of estuarine gull, they had come up the river during the previous months and begun to congregate among the ventilation shafts and water storage tanks, infesting the tunnels of the deserted sculpture garden. During his convalescence, he had watched them arrive as he sat in his wheelchair on the private terrace. Later, when the calisthenics machine had been installed, the birds would hobble around the terrace while he exercised. In some way they were attracted by Royal's white jacket and pale hair, so close in tone to their own vivid plumage. Perhaps they identified him as one of their own, a crippled old albatross who had taken refuge on this remote rooftop beside the river. Royal liked this notion, and often thought about it. The French windows swung in the early evening air. The Alsatian had escaped, hunting by itself on the 500-feet-long observation deck. Now that the summer had ended, few people went up to the roof. The remains of a cocktail party marquee, bedraggled in the rain, lay in the gutter below the balustrade. The gulls, heavy wings folded, strutted among the cheese sticks scattered around a cardboard carton. The potted palms had been untended for months, and the whole roof increasingly resembled a voracious garden. Royal stepped down onto the roof deck. He enjoyed the hostile gaze of the birds sitting on the elevator heads. The sense of a renascent barbarism hung among the overturned chairs and straggling palms, the discarded pair of diamante sunglasses from which the jewels had been picked. What attracted the birds to this isolated realm on the roof? As Royal approached, a group of the gulls dived into the air, soaring down to catch the scraps flung from a balcony 10 floors below them. They fed on the refuse thrown into the car park, but Royal liked to think that their real motives for taking over the roof were close to his own, and that they had flown here from some archaic landscape, responding to the same image of the sacred violence to come. Fearing that they might leave, he frequently brought them food, as if to convince them that the wait would be worth their while. He pushed back the rusty gates of the sculpture garden. From the casement of a decorative lantern he took out a box of cereal meal, by rights reserved for the Alsatian. Royal began to scatter the grains among the concrete tunnels and geometric forms of the play sculptures. Designing the garden had given him particular satisfaction, and he was sorry that the children no longer used the playground. At least it was open to the birds. The gulls followed him eagerly, their strong wings almost knocking the cereal box from his hands. Leaning on his stick, Royal swung himself around the pools of water on the concrete floor. He had always wanted his own zoo, with 6 large cats and, more important, an immense aviary stocked with every species of bird. Over the years he had sketched many designs for the zoo, one of them, ironically, a high-rise structure, where the birds would be free to move about in those sections of the sky that were their true home. Zoos, and the architecture of large structures, had always been Royal's particular interest. The drenched body of a Siamese cat lay in the gutter where the birds had cornered it. The small beast had climbed all the way up a ventilation shaft from the warm comfort of an apartment far below, embracing the daylight for a few last seconds before the birds destroyed it. Next to the cat was the carcass of a dead gull. Royal picked it up, surprised by its weight, stepped forward, and with a powerful running throw hurled the bird far out into the air. It plummeted towards the ground in an almost unending downward plunge until it burst like a white bomb across the bonnet of a parked car. No one had seen him, but Royal would not have cared anyway. For all his keen interest in his neighbors' behavior, he found it difficult not to look down on them. The 5 years of his marriage to Anne had given him a new set of prejudices. Reluctantly, he knew that he despised his fellow residents for the way in which they fitted so willingly into their appointed slots in the apartment building, for their overdeveloped sense of responsibility and lack of flamboyance. Above all, he looked down on them for their good taste. The building was a monument to good taste, to the well-designed kitchen, to sophisticated utensils and fabrics, to elegant and never ostentatious furnishings. In short, to that whole aesthetic sensibility which these well-educated professional people had inherited from all the schools of industrial design, all the award-winning schemes of interior decoration institutionalized by the last quarter of the 20th century. Royal detested this orthodoxy of the intelligent. Visiting his neighbors' apartments, he would find himself physically repelled by the contours of an award-winning coffee pot, by the well-modulated color schemes, by the good taste and intelligence that, Midas-like, had transformed everything in these apartments into an ideal marriage of function and design. In a sense, these people were the vanguard of a well-to-do and well-educated proletariat of the future. Boxed up in these expensive apartments, with their elegant furniture and intelligent sensibilities, and no possibility of escape. Royal would have given anything for one vulgar mantelpiece ornament, one less than snow-white lavatory bowl, one hint of hope. Thank God that they were at last breaking out of this fur-lined prison. On either side of him, the rain-soaked concrete stretched away into the evening mist. There were no signs of the white Alsatian. Royal had reached the center of the roof. The gulls sat on the ventilation shafts and elevator heads, watching him with their unusually alert eyes. Thinking that they might already have dined off the dog, Royal kicked aside an overturned chair and set off towards the stairhead, calling out the Alsatian's name. 10 feet from the private terrace at the southern end of the roof, a middle-aged woman in a long fur coat stood by the balustrade. Shivering continuously, she stared out across the development project at the silver back of the river. A trio of lighters followed a tug upstream, and a police patrol boat cruised along the north bank. As Royal approached, he recognized the widow of the dead jeweler. Was she waiting for the police to arrive, in some perverse way too proud to call them herself? He was about to ask if she had seen the Alsatian, but he knew already that she would not reply. Her face was immaculately made up, but an expression of extreme hostility came through the rouge and powder, a gaze as hard as pain. Royal held tight to his cane. The woman's hands were hidden from sight, and he almost believed that inside the coat her jeweled fingers held a pair of unsheathed knives. For some reason he was suddenly convinced that she had been responsible for her husband's death, and that at any moment she would seize him and wrestle him over the ledge. At the same time, to his surprise, he found himself wanting to touch her, to put his arm around her shoulders. Some kind of wayward sexuality was at work. For a grotesque moment, he was tempted to expose himself to her. "I'm looking for Anne's Alsatian," he said lamely. When she made no reply, he added, "We've decided to stay on." Confused by his response to this grieving woman, Royal turned away and made his way down the staircase to the floor below. Despite the pain in his legs, he walked swiftly along the corridor, striking at the walls with his cane. When he reached the central lobby, the sounds of the Alsatian's frantic barking rose clearly up the nearest of the 5 high-speed elevator shafts. Royal pressed his head to the door panel. The elevator car, with the Alsatian snarling and leaping inside it, was on the 15th floor, its doors jammed open. Royal could hear the heavy blows of a metal club striking at the floor and walls, and the shouts of 3 attackers, one of them a woman, as they beat the animal to the floor. When the dog's yelping subsided, the elevator at last responded to the call button. The car climbed to the top floor, where the doors opened on the barely conscious dog, dragging itself around the bloodied floor. The animal's head and shoulders were heavy with blood. Matted hair streaked the walls of the cabin. Royal tried to reassure it, but the Alsatian snapped at his hand, frightened of the stick. Several of his neighbors gathered around, carrying an assortment of weapons, tennis rackets, dumbbells, and walking sticks. They were beckoned aside by a friend of Royal's, a gynecologist named Pangborn, who lived in the apartment next to the lobby. A swimming partner of Anne's, he often played with the dog on the roof. "Let me have a look at him. Poor devil, these savages have abused you." Deftly he insinuated himself into the elevator and began to soothe the dog. "We'll get him back to your apartment, Royal. Then I suggest we discuss the elevator position." Pangborn knelt down on the floor, whistling a strange series of sounds at the dog. For some weeks the gynecologist had been urging Royal to interfere with the building's electrical switching systems, as a means of retaliating against the lower floors. This supposed power over the high-rise was the chief source of Royal's authority with his neighbors, though he suspected that Pangborn, for one, was aware that he would never make use of it. With his soft hands and consulting-room manner, the gynecologist unsettled Royal slightly, as if he were always just about to ease an unwary patient into a compromising obstetric position. In fact, though, Pangborn belonged to the new generation of gynecologists who never actually touched their patients, let alone delivered a child. His specialty was the computerized analysis of recorded birth cries, from which he could diagnose an infinity of complaints to come. He played with these tapes like an earlier generation of sorcerer examining the patterns of entrails. Characteristically, Pangborn's one affair in the high-rise had been with the laboratory researcher on the second floor, a slim, silent brunette who probably spent all her time tormenting small mammals. He had broken this off soon after the outbreak of hostilities. Nonetheless, he had a way with the injured Alsatian. Royal waited while he calmed the dog and examined its wounds. He held its muzzle in his white hands as if he had just freed the poor beast from its caul. Together, he and Royal half-carried and half-dragged the dog back to Royal's apartment. Fortunately, Anne and Jane Sheridan had left for the 10th floor supermarket, picking up the one elevator released for general traffic. Pangborn settled the dog on the dust sheet covering one of the sofas. "I'm glad you were here," Royal told him. "You're not at your practice?" Pangborn stroked the Alsatian's swollen head, his white hands delicate with blood. "I attend my consultancy 2 mornings a week. Just enough time for me to listen to the latest recordings. Otherwise, I'm on guard duty here." He peered pointedly at Royal. "If I were you, I'd keep a closer eye on Anne, unless you want her to be—" "Sound advice. You've never thought of leaving? The conditions now—" The gynecologist frowned at Royal as if unsure whether he was serious. "I've only just moved here. Why should I concede anything to these people?" He pointed expressively at the floor with a blood-stained finger. Impressed by the determination of this refined and punctilious man to defend his terrain, Royal followed him to the door, thanking him for his help, and promising to discuss with him the sabotage of the elevators. For the next half-hour, Royal cleaned the wounds of the Alsatian. Although the dog began to sleep, the bloodstains on the white dust sheet made Royal feel increasingly restless. The assault had released in him a more than half-conscious wish for conflict. To date he had been a moderating influence, restraining his neighbors from any unnecessary retaliatory action. Now he wanted trouble at any price. Somewhere below, a falling bottle burst on a balcony, a brief explosion against the rising background of over-noisy record players, shouts, and hammering. The light in the apartment had begun to fade, the shrouded furniture suspended around him like underinflated clouds. The afternoon had passed, and soon the danger period would begin. Thinking of Anne trying to make her way back from the 10th floor, Royal turned to leave the apartment. By the door he stopped, holding one hand over the dial of his wristwatch. His concern for Anne was as strong as ever. If anything, he felt more possessive towards her. But he decided to let another half-hour elapse before he went in search of her. Perversely, this would increase the element of danger, the chance of confrontation. He walked calmly around the apartment, noting the telephones on the floor and the neatly wrapped cables. Even if she were trapped somewhere, Anne would be unable to call him. While he waited for the darkness, Royal went up to the penthouse and watched the gulls on the elevator heads. In the evening light, their plumage was a vibrant white. Like birds at dusk, waiting among the cornices of a mausoleum, they flicked their wings against the bone-like concrete. As if agitated by Royal's confused state, they rose excitedly into the air. Royal was thinking of his wife, of the possible assaults on her, an almost sexual fever of hazard and revenge tightening his nerves. In another 20 minutes he would leave the apartment and make his killing drop down the shafts of the high-rise, murder descending. He wished he could take the birds with him. He could see them, diving down the elevator shafts, spiraling through the stairwells to swoop into the corridors. He watched them wheel through the air, listening to their cries as he thought of the violence to come. Chapter 9. Into the Drop Zone. At 7 o'clock, Anthony Royal set out with the white Alsatian to find his wife. The dog had recovered sufficiently from its beating to limp along in front of him. Its damp pelt was marked with a vivid crimson bloom. Like the bloodstains on his white jacket, Royal was proud of these signs of combat. As if mimicking the dog, he wore its blood on his chest and hips, the insignia of an executioner's apparel yet to be designed. He began his descent into the lower depths of the building in the high-speed elevator lobby. A group of excited neighbors had just emerged from one of the cars. 4 floors down, an apartment had been ransacked by a party of tenants from the 15th floor. These sporadic raids on apartments were taking place with increasing frequency. Empty apartments, even if left for no more than a single day, were especially vulnerable. Some unconscious system of communication alerted any would-be raiders that an apartment a dozen floors above or below was ripe for ransack. With difficulty, Royal found an elevator to take him down to the 35th floor. The restaurant had closed. After serving a last lunch to the Royals, the chef and his wife had left for good. Chairs and tables had been stacked around the kitchen in a barricade, and the revolving door was padlocked. The long observation windows, with their magnificent view, were shuttered and chained, throwing the north end of the pool into darkness. The last swimmer, a market analyst from the 38th floor, was leaving the swimming pool. His wife waited protectively outside his cubicle as he changed. She watched the Alsatian lapping at the water lying on the greasy tiles by the diving board. When the dog relieved itself against the door of an empty cubicle, her face was expressionless. Royal felt a modest pride in this act, which rekindled a primitive territorial reflex. The marking of this cubicle with the dog's overbright urine defined the small terrain coming under his sway. For the next hour, Royal continued his search for his wife, descending deeper into the central mass of the high-rise. As he moved from one floor to the next, from one elevator to another, he realized the full extent of its deterioration. The residents' rebellion against the apartment building was now in full swing. Garbage lay heaped around the jammed disposal chutes. The stairways were littered with broken glass, splintered kitchen chairs and sections of handrail. Even more significant, the payphones in the elevator lobbies had been ripped out, as if the tenants, like Anne and himself, had agreed to shut off any contact with the world outside. The further down Royal reached, the greater the damage. Fire safety doors leaned off their hinges, quartz inspection windows punched out. Few corridor and staircase lights still worked, and no effort had been made to replace the broken bulbs. By 8 o'clock, little light reached the corridors, which became dim tunnels strewn with garbage sacks. The lurid outlines of lettered slogans, aerosoled in luminous paint across the walls, unraveled around him like the decor of a nightmare. Rival groups of residents stood around in the lobbies, guarding their elevators and watching each other along the corridors. Many of the women had portable radios slung from their shoulders, which they switched from station to station as if tuning up for an acoustic war. Others carried cameras and flash equipment, ready to record any acts of hostility, any incursions into their territory. By changing elevators and making journeys of 2 floors at a time, Royal finally descended into the lower half of the apartment building. He was unmolested by the other residents, who watched him as he entered their lobbies, moving out of his way as he strolled past. The wounded Alsatian and Royal's blood-stained jacket gave him free passage through these rival clans, as if he were a betrayed landowner descending from his keep to parade his wounds among his rebellious tenants. By the time he reached the 10th floor, the concourse was almost deserted. A few residents wandered around the shopping mall, staring at the empty chromium counters. The bank and liquor store were closed, their grills chained. There was no sign of Anne. Royal led the Alsatian through the swing doors into the swimming pool, now barely half full. The yellow water was filled with debris, the floor at the shallow end emerging like a beach in a garbage lagoon. A mattress floated among the bottles, surrounded by a swill of cardboard cartons and newspapers. Even a corpse would go unnoticed here, Royal reflected. As the Alsatian snuffled its way along the vandalized changing cubicles, Royal waved his cane at the humid air, trying to stir it into life. He would soon suffocate here in the lower section of the apartment building. During even this brief visit, he had felt crushed by the pressure of all the people above him, by the thousands of individual lives, each with its pent-up time and space. From the elevator lobby on the far side of the swimming pool came the sounds of shouting. Urging on the dog, Royal strode to the rear exit behind the diving boards. Through the glass doors he watched a heated argument taking place outside the entrance to the junior school. Some 20 men and women were involved, one group from the lower floors carrying desks and chairs, a blackboard and an artist's easel, the other trying to prevent them from reoccupying the classrooms. Scuffles soon broke out, egged on by a film editor wielding a desk over his head. The parents pressed forward determinedly. Their opponents, residents from the 11th and 12th floors, stood their ground, forming a heavy breathing cordon. A bad-tempered brawl developed, men and women wrestling clumsily with each other. Royal pulled the Alsatian away, deciding to leave this jostling group to settle their own dispute. As he turned to continue his search for Anne, the staircase doors leading into the lobby were flung back. A group of residents, all from the 14th and 15th floors, leapt out and hurled themselves into the melee. They were led by Richard Wilder, Cinecamera gripped like a battle standard in one hand. Royal assumed that Wilder was filming an episode from the documentary he had been talking about for so long, and had set up the entire scene. But Wilder was in the thick of the fray, aggressively wielding the Cinecamera as he urged on his new allies against his former neighbors. The raiding party was shouldered back towards the staircase in disarray, the parents dropping the desks and blackboard. Wilder slammed the staircase doors behind them. Expelling his sometime neighbors and friends had clearly given him enormous satisfaction. Waving the camera, he pointed to the classroom of the junior school. 2 young women, Royal's wife and Jane Sheridan, were crouching behind an overturned desk. Like children caught red-handed in some mischief, they watched Wilder as he beckoned theatrically towards them. Holding the Alsatian on a short leash, Royal pushed back the glass doors. He strode through the residents in the lobby, who were now happily breaking out the children's desks. "It's all right, Wilder," called out in a firm but casual voice. "I'll take over." He stepped past Wilder and entered the classroom. He lifted Anne to her feet. "I'll get you out of here. Don't worry about Wilder." "I'm not." For all her ordeal, Anne was remarkably unruffled. She gazed at Wilder with evident admiration. "My God, he's rather insane." Royal waited for Wilder to attack him. Despite the 20 years between them, he felt calm and self-controlled, ready for the physical confrontation. But Wilder made no attempt to move. He watched Royal with interest, patting one armpit in an almost animal way, as if glad to see Royal here on the lower levels, directly involved at last in the struggle for territory and womenfolk. His shirt was open to the waist, exposing a barrel-like chest that he showed off with some pride. He held the cinecamera against his cheek as if he were visualizing the setting and choreography of a complex duel to be fought at some more convenient time on a stage higher in that building. That night, when they had returned to their apartment on the 40th floor, Royal set about asserting his leadership of the topmost levels of the high-rise. First, while his wife and Jane Sheridan rested together in Anne's bed, Royal attended to the Alsatian. He fed the dog in the kitchen with the last of its food. The wounds on its shoulders and head were as hard as coins. Royal was more aroused by the injuries to his dog than by any indignity suffered by his wife. He had almost made Anne's ordeal certain by deliberately postponing his search for her. As he expected, she and Jane had been unable to find an elevator when they had finished shopping at the supermarket. After being molested in the lobby by a drunken sound man, they had taken refuge in the deserted classroom. "They're all making their own films down there," Anne told him, clearly fascinated by her heady experience of the lower orders at work and play. "Every time someone gets beaten up, about 10 cameras are shooting away." "They're showing them in the projection theater," Jane confirmed. Jane confirmed. Jane confirmed. Jane confirmed.